bana bana, sango sango, simba simba, tanda tanda, heo heo, baba ye, tika tika, samba ye,
Before European contact, West Africa was home to some of the most powerful and organized societies in the world, each with complex political structures, sophisticated economies, and global trade networks. The Mali Empire, once the wealthiest power in the region, was in decline. They once controlled the flow of gold and salt across the Sahara, ensuring that its riches filled the courts of its rulers and the markets of North Africa. The decline of Mali began in the late 14th century, weakened by internal conflicts, succession struggles, and external invasions. By the early 1400s, the Songhai Empire, once vassals of Mali, emerged as the new hegemon, extending its influence over Timbuktu and Gao, two cities that stood at the heart of African scholarship and commerce. They were part of a global economy, commanding wealth and influence long before Europeans set foot on their shores. Despite the grandeur of these empires, their internal struggles, shifting power dynamics, and external pressures set the stage for a transformation that would change the fate of the continent. The decline of Mali and the eventual collapse of Songhai in 1591 played a crucial role in fueling the transatlantic slave trade. Without a central authority to maintain stability, the region fell into cycles of infighting and power struggles that directly contributed to the supply of captives to both the trans-Saharan and transatlantic slave trades. The Moroccan invasion of Songhai in 1591 proved far more consequential than previous conflicts. Equipped with muskets and cannons, Moroccan forces shattered Songhai's rule at the Battle of Tondibi, capturing key cities like Timbuktu and Gao. Though they failed to maintain lasting control, their invasion fractured the political stability of West Africa, creating a power vacuum that coastal kingdoms would later exploit as the transatlantic trade expanded in the 17th century. It was not the remnants of Mali or Songhai that supplied European ships, but the coastal states of Congo, Wolof, Benin, Asante, and Dahomey, which turned the enslavement of captives into an industry of its own. Unlike feudal Europe, where peasants were legally tied to landowners, West African societies allowed greater mobility. The majority of people were not bound to the land and were free to cultivate fields, trade goods, or serve in the armies of their rulers. Agriculture was abundant, producing millet, yams, rice, and livestock that sustained large populations and allowed cities to flourish. The markets were bustling, filled with merchants trading gold, salt, textiles, and horses. Wealth did not come from taxing individuals, as was common in Europe or the Islamic caliphates, but from controlling trade and collecting tribute from vassal states. Rulers maintained their power by ensuring that gold and goods flowed through their courts, while powerful merchant families helped sustain the economy. This system provided prosperity, but it also created vulnerabilities. The strength of these empires depended entirely on the control of trade routes and the loyalty of their vassals. If trade was disrupted, or if a province became wealthy enough to operate independently, the empire itself would weaken. Without direct taxation, rulers could not easily rebuild their power if trade collapsed. If tribute payments stopped, the military could not be maintained, and the empire would fracture. These vulnerabilities were not yet a serious threat, but everything would change when European traders arrived. As we look at life in this era, one striking contrast emerges: West Africa's dynamic social mobility versus Europe's rigid feudal system. Farmers, artisans, and merchants controlled their labor and wealth. Kinship networks played a role, but there was no rigid caste system like in Europe. Meanwhile, in feudal Europe, peasants, called serfs, were legally tied to the land. They could not leave without their lord's permission, and their labor was not their own. Wealth remained concentrated in the hands of the nobility and monarchy, while the peasants lived in poverty. West African societies did not operate under the same feudal system as Europe. where land ownership determined power. Instead, governance in West Africa was based on trade, kinship networks, military strength, and tribute systems. One of the key factors in the instability of West African states was their system of governance, which, unlike European feudalism, allowed for more fluid succession and power struggles. Kingship was often hereditary, but not strictly bound to primogeniture, the automatic inheritance by the eldest son. Instead, rulers were often chosen from within the royal lineage, based on merit, military strength, or political alliances, leading to frequent internal conflicts and contested successions. Additionally, religious legitimacy played a crucial role in leadership changes. In Islamic states, such as Sokoto, Fouta Djallon, and Mali, rulers often had to gain the approval of Islamic scholars and religious leaders, sometimes leading to revolts or jihads against rulers seen as corrupt or un-Islamic. This system meant that West African states were inherently more flexible, but also more prone to internal disputes and civil wars, which weakened central authority and made them vulnerable to external influences, including the slave trade. In Europe, kings granted land to nobles, who ruled over vassals and peasants. Power was hereditary and rigid. Lords controlled everything, including taxation, justice, and military service. Serfs had no say in how they were governed. West Africa's economy thrived on trade. Gold, salt, ivory, and textiles moved across vast networks from Timbuktu to the Mediterranean. Most farmers owned their land or worked in cooperatives, and cities flourished as commercial hubs. In contrast, Europe's economy was based on feudal agriculture. Serfs worked land owned by nobles and had to surrender a portion of their harvest. Trade was controlled by noble elites and merchant guilds, leaving peasants with little to no economic freedom. In West Africa, people had the freedom to move between regions, change professions, and participate in governance through kinship networks. While slavery existed, it was often temporary or based on war captivity. In feudal Europe, a serf's life was strictly controlled. They needed permission to marry, move, or change professions. Escaping feudalism was nearly impossible, and peasants had no way to improve their status. West Africa was home to major centers of learning, such as Timbuktu, where scholars preserved knowledge in fields like science, philosophy, and literature. Education was accessible to those who sought it. In feudal Europe, education was controlled by the church. Only nobles and clergy had access to reading and writing. Most peasants remained illiterate, ensuring their dependence on their lords and religious leaders. While feudal Europe trapped peasants in a cycle of generational poverty, West Africa's flexible social and economic structures allowed for mobility and growth. This historical contrast challenges the way we understand freedom and opportunity in the pre-modern world. The feudal system in Europe, where people were bound to land and labor with little hope of escape, is eerily reminiscent of what would later become the racialized and permanent system of slavery in the Atlantic world. What began as a structure of economic servitude evolved into a system that denied entire populations their humanity based on race. Trade was the backbone of West African empires, fueling their economies and ensuring the strength of their armies. Gold, salt, and other goods not only enriched these kingdoms, but also provided the necessary resources to maintain control over vast territories. However, the system was deeply competitive, as control over trade routes was directly tied to military power. For centuries, conflicts erupted between rival states over these lucrative trade networks. Whoever controlled the trade controlled the ability to fund their armies and expand their influence. This competition was deeply embedded in the system, ensuring that trade was not just an economic endeavor. It was a matter of survival. Unlike the Aztec and Inca empires, which were quickly overthrown by European invaders, West African kingdoms were too powerful and decentralized for direct conquest. Their armies were formidable, their cities well fortified, and their control over trade routes made them resilient to foreign domination. However, this decentralization became even more pronounced after the fall of the Songhai Empire in 1591. With its collapse, no single power controlled the major trade routes, leading to intensified rivalries between emerging states. Europeans quickly realized that direct military conquest was not a viable strategy, so they turned to economic and political manipulation instead. They saw that control of trade routes was central to maintaining military power and stability. By selectively arming rival groups, they created deeper fractures within these societies. This fragmentation allowed European traders to further exploit divisions, using firearms to manipulate local conflicts and maintain instability. European traders and explorers studied these trade networks extensively, identifying vulnerabilities in the West African system. By arming rival groups, European traders weakened the central authority of West African states, fueling internal wars that would devastate the region. They made sure that no one group could dominate the entire region, preventing any single empire from establishing stable control. This fragmentation ensured that trade routes remained in constant dispute, further destabilizing the region. They played both sides, supplying weapons to opposing factions and pitting them against each other. No matter who won, the Europeans ensured a steady flow of enslaved people, as the victors would capture and sell their enemies in exchange for more firearms. Control of trade routes became an even more volatile struggle, as new factions, empowered by European weapons, sought to overthrow existing rulers. Guns became the most valuable commodity, and with them came an increasing demand for captives to be traded in exchange. This shift fundamentally altered the balance of power in the region. As guns and enslaved people became the primary trade commodities, the very structure of West African society began to unravel. The same system that once provided prosperity, balanced resource distribution, and enabled social mobility was now weaponized against itself. What had once ensured stability and economic growth became a mechanism for internal collapse, as warfare and dependency on the slave trade eroded the foundations of these once thriving empires. What had once been a thriving trade system based on natural resources and economic exchange became one locked into a vicious cycle. States now needed enslaved people to acquire guns, and they needed guns to defend against rivals who were doing the same. This dependency on European trade, particularly for firearms, led to devastating consequences. Kingdoms that had once thrived off gold and salt now found themselves caught in an arms race that fueled warfare and internal destruction. The pre-colonial system was no longer sustainable, and the region was left vulnerable to external domination. Had these empires been able to sustain their armies through other means, rather than relying on trade for revenue, this downward spiral might have been avoided. Instead, the economic pressures of maintaining power forced many to engage in the very trade that would ultimately contribute to their collapse. History teaches us that division has always been Africa's greatest vulnerability. The European exploitation of African trade rivalries did not end with the transatlantic slave trade. It was a blueprint that continued through colonial rule, the Cold War, and even modern conflicts. Kwame Nkrumah, one of Pan-Africanism's strongest voices, warned that as long as Africa remained divided, it would be controlled by outside forces. He understood that the same strategy used to pit African kingdoms against each other centuries ago was being repeated through neo-colonialism, economic dependency, and foreign-backed conflicts. From the partitioning of Africa at the Berlin Conference to Cold War proxy wars that fueled civil conflicts across the continent, outside powers have continued to manipulate African divisions to serve their own economic and strategic interests. Even today, conflicts in various parts of Africa are often fueled by external influences, ensuring that resources, land, and political power remain contested. But history also provides a lesson in resilience. Whenever Africans have united, they have resisted exploitation. From the anti-colonial liberation movement to the creation of the African Union, there have always been efforts to reclaim sovereignty and self-determination. The challenge now is ensuring that Africa's future is not dictated by the same forces that shaped its past. As Nkrumah said, "Divided we are weak, united, Africa could become one of the greatest forces for good in the world." The true lesson from history is that Africa's strength lies not in competition for resources, but in cooperation and unity. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into history's hidden truths. See you in the next video.
Bana bana, sango sango, simba simba.